1898, in a cold shed in Paris, Marie and Pierre Curie isolated a new element out of tons of crushed ore, and Marie gave it a name. She called it polonium, after Poland. And at that moment, Poland did not exist. It had been wiped off the map of Europe more than a century earlier, carved up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Marie had grown up in a country that officially was not a country, under an empire that punished her language. She had no army and no platform. What she had was the right to name a thing that would appear in every chemistry textbook on Earth forever. So she used it. As far as anyone can tell, it is the first time an element was named as political protest. A century later, that element would kill a man in London. This is the history of polonium. Start with the question in the title, because it has a real answer, and the answer is the reason for everything that follows. Plutonium, which we covered in a previous video, has a fearsome reputation, and it deserves it. But if you compare the two substances gram for gram, polonium-210 is vastly more radioactive. The difference comes down to time. The main plutonium isotope used in weapons has a half-life of roughly 24,000 years, which means it releases its energy slowly, doling it out across a span longer than human civilization. Polonium-210 has a half-life of about 138 days. It is in a hurry. It dumps essentially everything it has within a year or two. So a given quantity of polonium is spitting out radiation at a rate hundreds of thousands of times greater than the same quantity of plutonium. On paper, by activity per gram, it is one of the most radioactive substances a person is ever likely to encounter. And yet, in a very real sense, it is also one of the safest. You could hold a sealed source of it in your closed hand and feel nothing, absorb nothing, and walk away entirely unharmed. Both of those things are true at once, and the space between them is where this entire story lives. The reason is the kind of radiation polonium emits. It is an alpha emitter, which means the particles it throws off are relatively large and heavy, and they do not travel far or penetrate much of anything. A single sheet of paper stops them. A layer of clothing stops them. The outermost layer of your own skin, which is made of dead cells, stops them completely. Alpha particles cannot reach the living tissue underneath. That is why polonium sat in laboratories and factories for the better part of a century without anyone treating it as a weapon. It looked, by every practical measure of workplace safety, like a manageable material. You did not need thick lead shielding. You did not need a concrete wall. You needed a container and sensible handling, and the radiation would stay where it was. But turn the situation inside out, and everything reverses. Get that same material inside a human body, past the skin that was stopping everything, and there is no barrier left. All of that ferocious activity, all of those alpha particles that could not get through a sheet of paper, are now being released directly into living tissue at point-blank range with nothing in the way. And because alpha particles are heavy, they do enormous damage over the short distance they travel. They tear through cells, wrecking the machinery inside them. A sheet of paper stops it, skin stops it. Nothing stops it once it is inside you. That single fact is the thesis of this video, and it explains the whole 120-year arc, why nobody feared it, why it was sold to consumers through the post, why it never showed up on the equipment designed to catch dangerous materials, and why, in 2006, it turned out to be almost perfectly suited to killing one specific person without anyone noticing until far too late. Hold on to that, and let us go back to the shed in Paris. The Curies were working through an enormous quantity of pitchblende, a heavy black ore, because Marie had noticed something that did not add up. The ore was more radioactive than its known uranium content could explain. Something else was in there, something more active. And in 1898, they proved it. In fact, they found two new elements that year. Polonium came first, announced in the July of that year. Radium followed in December. And radium promptly ate the world's attention. Radium glowed in the dark, which made it a sensation. It went into medicine, into watch dials, into tonics and cosmetics, and made Marie Curie a global celebrity. Polonium, discovered first, had no glow and no obvious application, and slid quietly into the background where it stayed for decades. It has been the forgotten sibling of that discovery ever since. But the name stuck, and the name mattered. Marie Curie had been born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw, in territory controlled by the Russian Empire. Poland had been partitioned out of existence in the late 1700s, and successive uprisings had been crushed. Under Russian rule, Polish language and history were suppressed in schools. As a girl, she attended classes where the students had to conceal what they were really studying if an inspector arrived. She could not attend university in her own homeland, in part because she was Polish and in part because she was a woman, and she eventually left for Paris to get the education that was denied her at home. Then, in a Paris shed, she found something no human being had ever seen, and she was handed the naming rights. She could have named it for a property, as chemists usually did, or for a Greek word, or for a planet. She named it for a country that had been erased by the same empire that had erased it, in a scientific paper that would be read across Europe. It was, quietly, an act of defiance, and it made the map of the periodic table carry a nation that the map of the world did not. Poland would not exist as an independent state again until 1918, 20 years after the element was named for it. Marie Curie lived to see it. And for a long time afterwards, polonium was simply an obscure, difficult, expensive substance that almost nobody had a use for. It is astonishingly rare in nature. It occurs in uranium ores in vanishingly small traces, so small that recovering meaningful amounts from ore is effectively impossible. Nearly all the polonium that has ever been used was made deliberately in reactors in tiny quantities. Which means that from the very beginning, this was a substance that only serious institutions could obtain. That fact will matter later. It is worth dwelling on how rare it actually is. Polonium exists in nature only as a fleeting product of uranium's decay, present in ore at concentrations so minute that the Curies had to process an enormous quantity of pitchblende to isolate a trace of it. Estimates of its natural abundance in the Earth's crust put it among the rarest elements there are. To have any usable amount, you effectively have to manufacture it, and manufacturing it requires a nuclear reactor, a supply of a specific starting material, and the facilities to handle what comes out. In practice, for most of the modern era, meaningful production has been concentrated in a small number of state-run facilities, with Russia long the dominant producer for commercial supply. This is not a substance that turns up on a black market shelf beside ordinary poisons. Wherever a quantity of it appears, it came from somewhere with a reactor. Then gradually, the world found uses for it, and they are stranger than you might expect. The most surprising is that polonium became a consumer product. Because alpha particles are so energetic over short distances, they knock electrons off the atoms in the air they pass through, turning ordinary air into a conductor. And air that conducts electricity will quietly drain away a static charge. Static was, and is, a genuine industrial nuisance. Dust clings to charged surfaces, sheets of paper stick together and jam machinery. Photographic film and negatives attract every particle in the room. So manufacturers put small sealed polonium sources into anti-static devices, brushes, strips, and bars mounted on printing presses and industrial machinery and sold to photographers to sweep across negatives and to audiophiles to run over vinyl records before playing them. Sit with that for a moment. There was a period when you could order, through the post, a small brush containing one of the most radioactive substances known in order to keep dust off your record collection. And the extraordinary thing is that this was not reckless, the sources were sealed, the alpha particles could not escape the housing, and used as intended, these devices genuinely were safe to handle. That is exactly the point. Polonium's danger is so completely invisible from the outside that it could be sold as a household accessory without anyone behaving irresponsibly. Sources of this kind are still manufactured and sold for industrial anti-static use today, under license and with strict conditions on their handling and disposal. Its second use was military and brief. During the Second World War, the American atomic bomb program needed a component to start the chain reaction at precisely the right instant, and polonium, paired with another element, could do it. Production was handled at a secret facility in Dayton, Ohio, in a set of converted buildings, including a former mansion, where workers processed material for the initiators at the heart of the first weapons. Many of them had no clear idea what they were making. Those workers accumulated exposures that were tracked for decades afterwards, and the site itself required a long and expensive cleanup, with contaminated buildings demolished and material removed. That is the whole of the bomb story here, because this channel has covered the wider program in the uranium and plutonium videos, and it is not what makes polonium interesting. The third use was in space, and it is oddly charming. Polonium's rapid decay produces a great deal of heat for its size. In 1970, when the Soviet Union landed the first successful robotic rover on the moon, the vehicle faced a brutal problem. The lunar night lasts about 2 Earth weeks, with temperatures far below anything the electronics could survive. The solution was a polonium heat source, which kept the rover's interior warm through each long night so that it could wake up and continue working when the sun returned. A substance discovered in a Paris shed as a protest against an empire kept a Soviet machine alive on the moon. And then there is the cost this element charged the family that found it, though we have to be careful about exactly how much of it we attribute. Irène Joliot-Curie was Marie's elder daughter and a formidable scientist in her own right. She and her husband shared a Nobel Prize in chemistry for their work on artificial radioactivity. In 1946, according to widely repeated accounts, a sealed capsule of polonium ruptured on her laboratory bench, and she inhaled a quantity of it. 10 years later, in 1956, she died of leukemia at the age of 58. Whether that specific accident caused that specific death is not something anyone can prove. Irène had spent her entire life around radioactive materials, beginning as a teenager operating mobile radiography units near the front lines of the First World War alongside her mother. And any of that exposure could have contributed. Her mother had died of a blood disorder almost certainly linked to a lifetime of the same work. What can be said is that the accident is documented, that she believed it had harmed her, and that a family which had given the world these elements was steadily consumed by them across 2 generations. The woman who named an element after her erased homeland. The daughter who died of the family trade. And the element itself, by the end of the 20th century, had settled into total obscurity. A specialist industrial material with a dull reputation, safe in its housings, useful for static and heat, watched by essentially nobody. Which is where the story turns, in a hotel bar in London on the 1st of November 2006. Alexander Litvinenko was a former officer of the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, the main successor to the KGB. In the late 1990s, he had gone public with explosive allegations about his own service, appearing at a press conference to accuse superiors of ordering a killing. He was prosecuted, imprisoned, and eventually fled Russia, receiving asylum in Britain in 2000. He settled in London with his wife Marina, and their son became a British citizen, and spent the following years writing and speaking publicly against the Russian state and its intelligence services. On that afternoon in November, he met 2 men from Moscow at the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair, a comfortable, unremarkable room in an expensive part of London. They had tea. He went home to his family. That evening, he began vomiting, and he did not stop. What followed was 3 weeks of deterioration that doctors could not explain. He was admitted to hospital. His condition worsened steadily. His white blood cell count collapsed. His hair fell out. The medical teams worked through the possibilities methodically. They suspected poisoning, and they tested for the substances that produced this pattern, including thallium, and they considered chemotherapy agents that damage the bone marrow in similar ways. The results kept coming back wrong. Part of the reason is the fact this video opened with. Hospitals and investigators did check for radiation, and the standard equipment used to detect it is built to find the penetrating kinds, the radiation that passes through walls and bodies and sets off the monitors at airports and borders. Alpha emission does not do that. It cannot even get through skin. A man could be dying of it in a hospital bed while a detector held beside him registered nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the photographs emerged. There is one image in particular that most people watching this will have seen. Litvinenko, in a hospital gown, propped up in bed, entirely bald, his face hollowed out, looking directly into the camera. It became one of the defining photographs of the decade. It was taken and released deliberately because he and those around him wanted the world to see what was happening to him while it was still happening. And through those weeks, while his body failed, he was working. British detectives sat at his bedside and took a long series of formal interviews in which he described in detail and while fully lucid whom he had met, where, and what he believed was being done to him. Those interviews became a central part of the evidence in everything that followed, which is an unusual thing to be able to say about a murder victim. Marina Litvinenko was there throughout. Most people who are poisoned cannot testify about it. He could, for 3 weeks, and he used every one of them. Only in the final days, and largely because a scientist thought to look for something nobody had considered, was the substance identified: Polonium 210. By the time the answer arrived, there was nothing to be done with it. There is no treatment that can undo that kind of internal damage once it has been delivered. Alexander Litvinenko died on the 23rd of November 2006 in University College Hospital in London. He was 43 years old. Before he died, he dictated a statement which was read out publicly after his death, in which he directly accused the president of Russia of responsibility for his killing. It is an extraordinary document precisely because of how he died. The substance worked slowly enough that he had time to understand what was happening, to talk to police at length from his hospital bed, and to say, on the record and for the world, who he believed had done it. The attribution has to be handled carefully, so here is exactly what has been formally concluded, and by whom. Britain held a public inquiry into the death chaired by Sir Robert Owen, which reported in January 2016. It concluded that Litvinenko was deliberately poisoned by 2 named men, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, that they were acting on behalf of the Russian FSB, and that the operation was probably approved at the highest levels of the Russian state, including, in the inquiry's words, probably by President Putin. Britain sought the extradition of both men. Russia refused, citing its constitution, and both have consistently denied any involvement. The Russian government has rejected the inquiry's findings entirely, characterizing them as politically motivated. In 2021, the European Court of Human Rights also found Russia responsible for the killing. Those are the findings of the bodies that examined it. They are not universally accepted, and Russia's denial stands. What is not in dispute is that a man was murdered with a radioactive element in a British hospital bed, and that his widow, Marina, spent years fighting to force the inquiry into existence and has continued to campaign since. And then came the part that no one who chose this method could have anticipated. Polonium contaminates, it transfers, it gets on hands and door handles and cups and fabric, and it stays there, quietly emitting, marking every surface it has touched. And once British investigators knew what they were looking for and brought in equipment capable of finding alpha emission, they discovered that the murder had drawn a map of itself across London. They found traces at the Millennium Hotel, including in the Pine Bar, and reporting from the investigation described contamination in the bar area and on items connected to the table where the men had sat. They found it in hotel rooms elsewhere in the city, in office buildings, in restaurants, in a bar at a football stadium, in vehicles, and in the homes of the people involved. They found it at Litvinenko's own house. And they found it on aircraft. Because commercial airliners had flown the route between Moscow and London and had carried people who had been in contact with the material, traces turned up inside passenger cabins. Airlines had to ground and check planes. British authorities publicly appealed for thousands of passengers who had traveled on the affected flights to come forward and set up a hotline and tested people. Hundreds of sites were examined. It is, as far as anyone knows, the only murder in history in which the weapon painted a glowing trail of its own movements across a capital city and out into the international air network. The property that made the substance undetectable in a hospital ward made it, once identified, almost impossible to hide afterwards. There is a second consequence of that trail, which is easy to overlook. For a period of weeks, a major European capital had to run a public health operation around a single murder. People who had served drinks in a bar, cleaned hotel rooms, sat in aircraft seats, or eaten at particular restaurants were contacted and offered testing, and a number of them were found to have been exposed at low levels. None of them had any connection to intelligence work or to the victim. They were bar staff and passengers and hotel workers who had walked through the wrong room on the wrong day. The overwhelming majority were reassured that their exposures were too small to be expected to harm them, but they had to live through the weeks of not knowing. A weapon, chosen for its precision, turned out to be one of the messiest ever used. Litvinenko's case is the one that everyone knows. There has been at least one other high-profile claim, and it is genuinely unresolved. In 2012, a Swiss institute reported finding elevated levels of polonium-210 on personal effects belonging to Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader who had died in 2004 after a sudden illness that was never satisfactorily explained. His remains were exhumed and samples were examined by 3 separate teams from Switzerland, France, and Russia. Their conclusions did not agree. The Swiss team reported findings they said moderately supported the possibility of poisoning. The French team concluded the results did not support it. The Russian team also did not support it. The case has never been resolved, and it remains contested. That is where it sits, and it is not this video's place to settle it. Which brings us to the last thing, and it is the one that touches the largest number of people by far. There is polonium-210 in cigarette smoke. It gets there in 2 ways. Tobacco plants have large, sticky leaves that catch airborne particles containing natural decay products from the soil and the air. And the phosphate fertilizers used on tobacco crops contain trace amounts of radioactive material that the plant takes up. The result is that tobacco leaf carries small quantities of polonium, and when it burns, some of that comes through in the smoke and is inhaled directly into the lungs of the smoker, where it settles in the airways. 2 things need to be said about this, and the order matters. The first is proportion. Polonium is not the main reason cigarettes cause cancer. Tobacco smoke contains a large number of well-established carcinogens, and the radioactivity is a small contributor within a much larger and much more thoroughly documented problem. Researchers have estimated it may account for some fraction of smoking-related lung cancers, and those estimates vary considerably. Nobody should come away from this thinking polonium is the story of cigarettes. It is a footnote to it. The second is the part that will sound familiar. Researchers examining internal tobacco industry documents released through litigation have reported that companies were aware of polonium in tobacco from around the 1960s. That they studied the question internally over a period of decades, that they investigated whether it could be reduced, and that they did not publicize what they found. The concern documented in those papers, according to the researchers who analyzed them, included how the public would react if the presence of a radioactive substance in cigarettes became widely known. It is the same pattern this channel has traced through lead, through sugar, through asbestos. Not a conspiracy to poison anybody, but a decision made quietly that the public did not need to be told something the company already knew. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. A young woman from a country that had been erased from the map found something nobody had ever seen, and named it for that country, because naming was the only weapon she had against people who erase things. The element she named turned out to be one of the most intensely radioactive substances known, and simultaneously one of the least threatening to stand next to, because its radiation cannot cross a sheet of paper or a layer of dead skin. That paradox defined everything. It is why polonium was sold in the post as a brush for cleaning records. It is why it kept a Soviet rover warm on the moon. It is why it sat in industry for decades, sealed and dull and unwatched, while the world's attention went to its glamorous sibling radium and to the elements that could level cities. And it is why in 2006, an amount too small to see could be carried into a hotel bar in Mayfair without setting off a single alarm anywhere along the way, and used to kill one man slowly over 3 weeks, while doctors tested him for everything else. Every other substance in this series killed at scale, or by accident, or by neglect. Uranium killed miners who could not have known. Lead killed everyone who used it for centuries, despite the warnings. Ammonium nitrate erased a waterfront because of paperwork nobody read. They are stories about populations, about industries, about entire eras getting something wrong. Polonium is the smallest story here. And that is what makes it the coldest. It was not a mistake, and it was not a system failing. It was one person chosen and a substance selected precisely because it would not be noticed until the damage was already complete. Marie Curie named it after a nation that powerful people had erased, as a way of insisting that something erased could still be made to exist. A century later, the element carrying that name was used to erase a man, slowly enough that he could watch it happen and speak and be photographed doing it and say for the record what he believed had been done to him and by whom. It was the perfect weapon because it looked like nothing at all. That is exactly what it was chosen for. If this changed the way you think about what can be hidden in plain sight, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of Polonium's story you had never heard before. And share this with someone who has never once wondered how something too small to see could leave a trail across an entire city.